Some following hardship in the Highlands, others seeking opportunity and adventure, came here to the port of Greenock in the Firth of Clyde, where they took ship for the Americas, and later for the younger countries of Australia and New Zealand, an emigration which continued almost to the middle of this century. But wherever they went in the world, these millions of Scots took with them the heritage, the sense of history, the traditions of this, their homeland. From scenes like these, old Scotia's grandeur springs. It makes her loved abroad, revered at home. From the towering snow-capped highlands in the north, through the purple-heathered glens of swirling mist, and on to the softly rolling hills of the borders, this ancient and beautiful land of Scotland is held dear in the hearts of millions of Scots worldwide. The story of Scotland and of her peoples is as complex and diverse as the many different cultures and traditions which have merged to form this most unique of countries. Cultures which have clashed through time, Highland and Lowland, Jacobite and Hanoverian, and yet have given birth to the stirring romanticism of the Gaelic lordship of the Isles, and to the remarkable achievements of the royal house of Stuart. Our story begins over 6,000 years ago, with the arrival of the first settlers in Scotland. These early pioneers discovered a deeply forested land, brooding and impenetrable. They settled along the coast and on the riverbanks. They lived by fishing and hunting in the dark woodlands. Enigmatic remains of these peoples can still be found. But their lives and thoughts are lost to us now, kept secret in this land once called Alba, now called Scotland. The Roman legions marched into Scotland about 80 AD, and it is from their historians we have the first records of this land and of her peoples. To the northeast, the oldest inhabitants, known as the Picti, or the Painted people, whose origin is unknown to us. In the western Highlands, the Gaelic-speaking Celts, or Scoti, who had sailed from Ireland. Across the lowland areas were the Brythonic Celts. Their legends were those of King Arthur, and theirs was the magical land of Camelot. The Romans, who had conquered the known world, never managed to quell the indomitable spirit of Scotland. They ruled Britain for almost 4 centuries, but built the famous Hadrian's Wall to keep the warlike Scots at bay. With the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Anglo and the Saxon came to the lowlands. In time, Viking raiders came too, and with fire and sword conquered the north, east, and much of the Western Isles. For hundreds of years, Viking, Saxon, Celt and Pict clashed in their battle for supremacy. The skill and courage of these warriors is reflected in the game of shinty, still played in the Highlands today. By the 11th century, the Gaelic Highlands won out. And as Gaelic became the principal language and culture, so the Gaelic use of surnames became widespread. They developed from 4 principal roots: from a person's occupation, as in Fierce, meaning parson; from a place of residence, as in Sutherland, from the lands of Sutherland; from a physical feature, as in Armstrong, a little reference to a strong arm. The most popular form of surname in Scotland, however, is the Gaelic use of the word Mac, meaning son of, as in MacDonald, son of Donald. The origin of the name MacLean is derived from son of Gaelic, ancestor of your clan. For a person with Scottish roots, your surname is only one clue in the search for your ancestry, for unique to Scotland is the ancient system of clans. The word clana is derived from the Gaelic and means children or family. It is used in its present-day context to mean an extended family, often, though not always, sharing a common name, united under a chief and bound together by a shared heritage. The clans practiced a sophisticated system of government which survived often independently of the rest of Scotland for nearly 5 centuries. They often banded together into great confederations. The Clan Chattan and the Lordship of the Isles were the most enduring. Indeed, so powerful did the lordship become that its power stretched along the entire western seaboard and reached inland to include much of what is now considered Highland. Few today know more about this age-old method of kinship and government than Rob MacDonald Parker of the Clandonald Centre at Armadale.
The clans in Scotland have been around since the 11th century and probably beyond that. The word clan is an old Gaelic word which means children. A closer description would perhaps be kin. The clans as we know them today are probably much later. After the lordship of the Isles collapsed in the 15th century, the families kind of broke out into their own separate branches, and groups such as the Keppochs and the Glengarrys identified themselves much more clearly under a clan chief. By and large, they lived very democratically, particularly through the period of the lordship of the Isles, where on the council meetings, MacDonald sat at the head of the table, but he was surrounded by MacLeans and MacLeods and McKinnons and other clans who equally had a part in this council. And they traded and they bartered and they arranged marriages and they passed laws and they heard complaints. And while the rest of the world would believe we were all red-haired, hairy Highlanders running out of the heather, I think there was some form of government that was quite beyond what was happening in other places. Well, the structure, of course, was the chief would be at the head, considered in the clan terms as the first amongst equals. His lieutenants, or his right hand, so to speak, would be the closest members of his family, and throughout the clan it would descend in order of your closeness to the chief. And the way this was interpreted was the job of the Shenachie, which is the Gaelic historian. And his job was to remember all of the family descendancies. And obviously the closer you could be to the chief, the better status you had within the clan. Obviously up until the Second Rebellion in 1745, the clans operated quite well under their clan chiefs. But after the Battle of Culloden, the whole system collapsed. And in 1746, the Prescription Act was passed by the government, which insisted that the families, the children of the chiefs, had to go south for education. And of course, they came back anglicized as opposed to being Highland. The family still comes into it. Today, I meet American clansmen, Australian clansmen, and I feel as if I've known them all my life. They're invited to my home, I'm invited to their home, and we only met each other maybe 10 minutes before, and it's just this. There's a complete relaxation and trust of a fellow clan member. I go to America once a year to speak to the Clandonald USA annual general meeting, and I'm always amazed that having made the long journey from Scotland to America, when I get there and I walk in, it's almost like I've just been next door for the last year. People say, "Hi Rob," like they see me all the time, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful relationship.
The forefathers of Clan MacLean are thought to derive from a race who were once settled in the ancient royal site of Scone in Perthshire. Another account gives that they were one of the old tribes of Murray transplanted during King Malcolm's purge of these lands in 1160. Whatever the truth, their undoubted ancestor was Gillian of the Battle Axe, who lived in the 13th century and fought at the Battle of Largs in 1263, when Alexander drove the Norsemen back into the sea. It is said that Gillian could trace his roots through an abbot of Lismore to the kings of Dalriada. Gillian's son is reputed to have been the first to settle in Lorne, from where his son lent support to Bruce and his grandson fought at Bannockburn. The following generation settled in Mull, where 2 sons were born. Lachlan Lubanach, known as the Crafty, forefather of the MacLeans of Duart, and Hector Ragadach, the founder of the MacLeans of Lochbuie. The name MacLean derives from an ancient Celtic warrior called Gaelic of the battle axe. Hence, MacLean, the sons of Gaelic. Castle Duart has now been beautifully restored by the 26th chief and is open all through the summer to visitors. None is more welcome than a MacLean. The brothers Lachlan and Hector lived in the reign of Robert II and appear to have been followers of the MacDougall Lords of Lorne until a dispute caused the defection to his arch rival, the MacDonald Lord of the Isles. Their service to the Lord of the Isles earned the brothers grants of land on Mull and a new enemy, the MacKinnons, who had already been established there for some time. Lachlan married Margaret MacDonald, a daughter of the Lord of the Isles. He achieved this union by kidnapping her father until he agreed to the marriage. Their son was the famous Red Hector of the Battles, who perished in the bloody Battle of Harlaw in 1411, when the army of the Isles was heavily defeated by a lowland army. A dispute arose between the descendants of the brothers as to which was the elder and therefore the rightful chief, but the matter was not resolved, and each went his own way, leaving to posterity two distinct MacLean clans. But a third race had already evolved. Charles, another son of Hector Raganach, had settled in Glen Urquhart, and his race, still extant, allied themselves with Clan Chatton and are known to us as Clan Chiarlach, or the MacLeans of Dochgarach. That they still felt kinship with Mull is evidenced by their appeal to MacLean to persuade the Chisholms, who had been oppressing them, to desist. The lordship of the Isles came to an end in 1492, and by that time the MacLeans were already a force to be reckoned with. They controlled most of Mull and its surrounding islands, as far south as the cradle of the lordship in Islay, and on the mainland they held much in Morven, Knapdale and Lochaber. With the notable exception of Glen Urquhart, there were now 4 great houses of MacLeans. The most important factor in the development of Scottish culture, and ultimately the clan system, was the advent of Christianity, brought to Scotland in the 6th century by St. Columba. Columba was an Irishman, a Celtic prince of the O'Neills and a most remarkable man. To atone for the blood he had shed as a warrior, he became a priest and chose to exile himself as a missionary in Scotland. He arrived in Dalriada in 563, just at a time when the Christian Scots had been crushed by the pagan Picts. Nevertheless, the hero Columba penetrated far into northern Pictland, converting the Druids to Christianity, and, it is said, quelling a monster he encountered in Loch Ness. Then he came to Iona and founded its monastery. Iona became an important ecclesiastical centre with contact throughout Europe. The spirit of Columba can still be sensed here on the hauntingly beautiful Isle of Iona. The monastery remains a place of pilgrimage and great spiritual power. The shared Christianity of Celt and Pict created an atmosphere of mutual trust and intermarriage. Here once stood the ancient city of Scone, the very first capital of Scotland and the heart of its history and faith. For this is a place of kings. Here, after years of bitter enmity and wars, the Celts of the west and the Picts of the east were at last united under one high king. Kenneth MacAlpin, of mixed Celt and Pictish blood, was crowned king in 842. When Malcolm Canmore was crowned King of Scotland 200 years later, Scotland had become firmly established as a nation-state. Despite the rule of a single king, the clans maintained their own independence. There was much feuding and bloody warfare. The Duart side of the greater MacLean family, meanwhile, made many marriages with the Campbells of Argyll in the 16th century, but these did little to promote good feeling between the families. A story is still told in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland involving the Campbells and York clan. Domestic difficulties led Lachlan MacLean to hatch a plan to rid himself of his wife Elizabeth, one of the Argyll Campbells and a sister to the chief. One day he bound her and marooned her on a tidal rock in the Sound of Mull, which is still known as the Lady's Rock. MacLean was certain that his wife would have drowned and at once went to pay his respects to her family. He must have received a shock, for sitting at the head of the table was Elizabeth, who was most certainly alive. She had been rescued by passing fishermen after her husband had abandoned her. For whatever reason, perhaps to give Lachlan time to contemplate his death, which he knew must surely follow, the Campbells did not exact their revenge on the spot. An entire year was to pass before the MacLean was stabbed to death by Elizabeth's brother during a chance encounter in Edinburgh in 1523. Although Malcolm Kenmore's Scotland was a resolutely independent nation, events further south were soon to have an impact. In 1066, England was invaded by the Normans. Within 1 year, they had totally crushed all opposition. A wave of refugees swept north for the sanctuary of Malcolm Kenmore's Scotland. Among them, Edgar and Margaret, the children of the deposed King of England. When the English royal family fled to Scotland after the Norman invasion, King Malcolm fell quickly and deeply in love with the Princess Margaret. They were married soon after. It was a marriage that brought many changes to Scotland. Under Queen Margaret's influence, the Gaelic culture was slowly eroded in the lowlands. The Scots dialect of English began to replace Gaelic as the spoken language. The dress and manners of the English court became commonplace, and the Scottish church was radically altered. In time, the Normans and the Scots of the lowlands began a period of intermarriage, trade and commerce. Much land was granted to the Norman knights, who established their own family dynasties. Lord Elgin, a descendant of Robert the Bruce, whose own family was established at this time.
I think you would usually say that it was families north of the Highland line in Scotland, where a great chief, the strongest member of a family, had established himself and his descendants, all of whom consider themselves descended from the original chief. Sometimes he was undoubtedly a figure which could be pointed out historically. Other times, I believe you might almost say that it was a figment of the imagination. But still, this feeling that every member was directly descended from the original chief. In other parts of Scotland, families undoubtedly had a close network of relationships, but I think they tended to consider their new family as equally as important as the original one. And in the case of my own family of Bruce, many of the junior branches of the family have been immensely distinguished and are entirely separate, as it were, in their way of thinking, and could not be considered in the same way as Highland families.
The great Norman families of the lowlands, newly established in the 1100s, were to play a major part in the growth and development of Scotland. England became fearful of this developing strength, and in 1244 launched the first of many invasions. For almost a century, the opposing armies clashed violently on the battlefields of the border. This warfare brought Scotland to the brink of disaster. The death of the king, Alexander III, in 1286, plunged the country into chaos. All seemed lost until the emergence of a new leader, Sir William Wallace. Wallace led an ever-increasing band of independent Scots into battle against the English, and with an ad hoc army vastly outnumbered, he achieved victory after victory. Here at Stirling Bridge, in 1297, the patriot Sir William Wallace routed the English army. King Edward was so incensed that he came to Scotland himself and for 2 whole years harried Wallace and his followers. Finally, in 1305, Wallace was betrayed, captured, and brought to the Tower of London, where he was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Edward's dream of a Scotland subject to the English crown was almost a reality. All that remained for him was to place his ally, John Comyn, on the throne. But Wallace's gruesome execution was not to be in vain. One of Edward's supporters, the young Scottish knight Robert the Bruce, had been inspired by Wallace's struggle for a free Scotland. In February 1306, Bruce called John Comyn to a fateful meeting in Greyfriars Church. The two men argued, swords were drawn, Comyn was struck and left fatally wounded at the altar. Bruce was forced into the life of a fugitive, pursued across the lowlands and highlands. Despite the impossible odds, many Scots slowly rallied to his banner. Towns and then castles came under his control. Essential to his campaign was the control of Stirling Castle. The garrison there agreed to surrender to Bruce if it was not relieved by the 24th of June. The massed armies of Edward II headed north and were in place by June 23rd. Bruce drew up his army on the banks of the Bannockburn. The Battle of Bannockburn took place on the morning of Midsummer's Day, 1314. Bruce, knowing he had the smaller forces, chose to occupy this high land, thus forcing the English army to come at him up the hill. At sunrise, the battle commenced, but the English armour soon found itself bogged down in the marshland waterlogged by the Bannockburn, and the English archers could find no place from which to attack. Sir Henry de Bohun, one of the bravest of the Norman knights, challenged Bruce to single combat. The Scots warrior king at once accepted. In the ensuing duel, he neatly avoided the Norman's lance and, swinging his battle-axe around his head in a huge arc, cleaved the Norman's skull with a single blow. The Scots cheered and charged, and before noon, King Edward was in full flight for the English border. 14 years of cross-border raiding followed until a treaty was finally signed. Scotland had won the day, and Robert the Bruce was her undisputed king. Bruce's campaign took place during the heyday of heraldry. One of Scotland's leading experts on heraldry is Alistair Campbell of Ayards, from the court of the Lord Lion.
It is a remarkable thing, but heraldry today in Scotland is more alive and part of our national life than it ever has been. It was in 1672 that the splendid series of arms recorded in Lion Office was first commenced, and in the last 30 years there have been as many grants and matriculations of arms as there were in the whole of the previous period put together. Heraldry came into Scotland, as with most of the rest of Europe, towards the middle of the 12th century. It had three important uses. The first, for personal identification, for people who were clad in all-enveloping armour, which might well have led to an unfortunate mistake in the heat of battle. Secondly, as a means of locating leaders in the field. And thirdly, very importantly, in the form of personal seals, as a means of authentication of important legal documents in a day and age when very few people, apart from the clergy, were capable of signing their own names. To make the system work, it required control, and here we see the arrival of the heralds. In Scotland, the chief post is held by the Lord Lion, King of Arms, whose origins go back to the royal shenachie of the ancient Celtic kings, although his title in its present form is first recorded in the 1300s. In Scotland, he is Her Majesty's Supreme Officer of Honour, to whom the monarch has delegated responsibility for all matters armorial. He is also responsible for state ceremonial and is a judge of the realm with very considerable powers. Heraldry in Scotland is very firmly controlled, and as a result it's the purest system in existence today. At the outset, it must be stressed that there is no such thing in Scotland as a family or clan coat of arms. A grant of arms is to one person and to one person only. And once that grant's been made, the arms pass without further formality to whoever inherits as head of the family. Other members of the family may take out arms which are suitably different from those borne by its head, and in the same way people of the same name, although they cannot trace their exact relationship, are given arms which are recognizably relative to those of the chief. And in this way, in Scotland, to the trained eye, it is always possible to recognize to which clan or family somebody belongs and their position in it. These are the personal arms of the chief of the clan MacLean, and as such can only be used by him. The quarterly shield is a typical West Highland one. In its first quarter, a rock, probably symbolic of the rock on which Duart Castle stands. In the second quarter is a red hand, the famous red hand of Ulster, symbolic of descent from the O'Neill High Kings of Ireland, holding in this case a blue crosslet fiche, to use the heraldic term, which combination is taken to mean a connection with the kindred of St. Columba, who was himself a member of the O'Neills. The third quarter is perhaps the most common one in West Highland heraldry, and shows the black galley of the Isles on a golden ground. The fourth quarter is made up of two eagles' heads looking at each other, and below a salmon, symbol of wisdom to the ancient Gael. Above the chief's helmet is his crest, an embattled tower, and above that again his motto, Virtue Mine Honour. The clansmen of the name of MacLean may all most properly wear this badge of the embattled tower within a buckled strap with the motto, Virtue Mine Honour, upon it.
The MacLeans of Duart and the MacLeans of Lochbuie did not get on. The MacLeans of Duart lived in Duart Castle, and their chief was Hector. The MacLeans of Lochbuie lived here at Castle Moy, and their chief was Ian the Toothless. Now it came to pass that Ian the Toothless was taken prisoner by Hector, and imprisoned by him on Cairnbeg Island to keep him away from the company of women so as to prevent his begetting an heir. However, Hector left with his old rival a maidservant who was so ugly that an alliance was thought highly improbable. But it came to pass that Ian the Toothless and the maidservant did beget an heir. He was called Murdoch the Stunted, and he returned to Mull to continue the line of the MacLeans of Lochbuie. It is said that Murdoch returned after many adventures, and by force of arms recovered his inheritance in 1538, and it is from that line all later chiefs of Lochbuie descend. Not all of the feuds the MacLeans were involved in ended in war. There is a story told that once, following a fierce battle between the Lochbuie MacLeans and the MacLeans of Duart, the victorious Lochbuies on their return home chanced upon the Duarts as they slept. The Lochbuie chief pinned the Duart chief's hair to the ground with his dirk or sword. When the Duart awoke, he at once recognized the dirk, and realizing that his opponent had spared his life, he at once called off the feud, and both sides lived to become friends. In the 17th century, Lachlan of Duart was created a baronet by King Charles I as a reward for his support in battle. Argyll, however, captured him, and only released him after he gave up bonds for his family's debts. Sir Lachlan joined the great Montrose when Argyll raided his family lands. Allied with Montrose, Clan MacLean inflicted a most grievous rout on the Argyll Campbells. Indeed, the victory was so absolute that Argyll never fully recovered. When he died in 1649, Sir Lachlan left two sons. One, Sir Hector, died while still very young, fighting for Charles II at Inverkeithing in 1651.
the other Alan, whose estate was only saved by Argyll's execution in 1661. Argyll's successor again began a process to dispossess the Duart MacLeans in 1672. When Sir Alan, 3rd Baronet, died in 1674, letters of treason and fire and sword issued against him, he left another infant heir. Within 5 years, much of the Duart lands had passed to the Campbells, and by the Revolution of 1688, the rest had followed. Sir John, the 4th Baronet, led the clan to Killiecrankie and Sheriffmuir in support of the Stuart cause, and when Sir Hector, the 5th Baronet, returned from exile in 1745 to gather support for Prince Charlie, he was captured en route and taken prisoner. He was released 2 years later and returned to exile. He died in Rome without any offspring. The representation of Duart then passed to the MacLeans of Brolas. In the rising of 1745, the clan was commanded at Culloden by MacLean of Drimmen, but suffered great casualties. Following the defeat of Bonnie Prince Charlie, the government of England set about the destruction of the Highland way of life. Many of your MacLean ancestors suffered greatly during this period, and they were to suffer even more during the period of the Highland clearances. But wherever your ancestors have travelled, they've kept a part of them that is forever Highland.
In the 200 years following the victory of Robert the Bruce, Scotland experienced a time of tremendous upheaval. The royal line of Scotland passed from the Bruce family to the Stuarts, a powerful dynasty often plagued by deceit, treachery, and greed. They sought to bring the clans of Scotland under their direct rule, to subdue the ancient Gaelic culture of the Highlands, a society based on equality, fair laws, and the code of hospitality, while the lowland system of government was feudal in nature. From the 14th to the 17th century, the Highlanders were continually harried by lowland armies who gradually won control. The age-old culture of the Lords of the Isles was passing into history. A time of great change across the entire continent of Europe, the 16th century Renaissance gave birth to the new Protestant faith. The charismatic preacher John Knox carried this new Christianity to the Scottish people, and within less than half a century it had become the dominant religion in Scotland. Spurred on by the ethos of this new religion, Scotland emerged as the world's leader in scientific, educational, and technological achievement. However, not all were converted to this new faith, among them the royal house of Stuart. Their staunch adherence to Roman Catholicism was to play a decisive role in their eventual downfall. In 1542, a week-old baby, Mary Stuart, became Mary, Queen of Scots. 6 years later, she was sent to France and returned at the age of 17 to take her place on the Scottish throne. Scotland was unprepared for her beauty and passionate nature. Her youthful charm won her many admirers and many enemies. In 1587, she was betrayed and beheaded at the command of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England. However, Elizabeth died childless, and Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, was crowned King James I of Scotland and England in 1603, the first monarch to rule both countries. The royal house of Stuart had reached the zenith of its power. 85 years later, it would be destroyed. Under Stuart rule, Britain was convulsed by two brutal civil wars. In the Second Civil War of 1689, James II became the last of the Stuart monarchs when he lost his crown to the Hanoverian William of Orange. He fled into exile, never to see Scotland again. The Stuart dynasty was to attempt to regain the throne one last time. In 1745, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, grandson of the exiled king, took ship from France, landing in the Western Highlands with the statement, "I am come home." Many of the Highland clans came out in support of Bonnie Prince Charlie, and his army marched to within 150 miles of London. Realising that no English would join him, he retreated to his Scottish headquarters at Culloden near Inverness. He was followed by an English army led by the Duke of Cumberland. The Scots were wakened at dawn on the 16th of April 1746 by the English drums and a barrage of artillery fire. In less than half an hour, all the dreams and ambitions of Bonnie Prince Charlie and his supporters had been blown away in the smoke of battle. Cumberland showed no mercy. The wounded were slaughtered where they lay, and those captured were burned alive.
With the defeat at Culloden, Charlie's year, or Gaelic as it's called in the Gaelic, was all but over. Cumberland sent out his troops in pursuit of those who had been out with Charlie. The government soldiers set fire to their houses, drove out their cattle, and laid waste to their lands.
The Clan MacLean have always been Jacobite. In 1745, they came out almost to a man in support of Bonnie Prince Charlie. And almost to a man, they died here at Culloden and are buried in a common grave.
After nearly 400 years, the Stuart dynasty had finally come to an end. For the clans, Culloden was the final crushing blow. The victorious Hanoverian government in London began to systematically dismantle the Scottish nation to ensure that Scotland could never again threaten English power. Scottish people were forbidden to wear the tartan, denied the right to carry weapons, even forbidden to play the pipes. The clan chieftains were stripped of their political status and reduced to mere landowners. In time, these landowners saw a better profit in wool and mutton and began evicting the Highlanders. The clearances had begun. The once vibrant Highlands were soon left desolate, stripped of the culture and a people who had lived there for 1,000 years. The lands they'd fought over, tilled and tended, were left bleak, populated only by sheep. The Scots have always had a sense of wanderlust, a pioneering spirit. Scots had been emigrating since the 16th century, indeed before that, often as mercenaries. But during the mid-18th century and on, they were actively encouraged to emigrate to the new worlds, America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Agents toured the country, employed by the various colonies to attract new settlers. The spirit of the Scots was spurred on by the lure of adventure and the opportunity to own land, land that could be passed on from generation to generation. The mixed fortunes of the different branches of the MacLeans saw many of the clansmen leaving Scotland. The new owners of the MacLean lands held none of the bonds of kinship to the tenants that the chiefs had, and proceeded to clear the people from the land. The clansmen set about making homes for themselves in places as far away as MacLean, New South Wales. Many left their mark in the new worlds. John MacLean, who was born on the Murray coast, emigrated to Canada, where he became the first Bishop of Saskatchewan and a founder of Alberta University. South of the border in the United States, the MacLeans made their presence felt. John MacLean was a member of the 13th and 14th Congresses, as well as a justice of the Supreme Courts. He's remembered for his anti-slavery stance. James Henry MacLean, who settled in Philadelphia, served in the 47th Congress. Closer to home, Hellfire Jack MacLean worked in the seafaring trade and became master of a clipper involved in the tea trade. He gained notoriety when he took on and beat the famous Cutty Sark. Scottish people have left their mark wherever they've gone. This impact is reflected in the wide variety of Scottish place names and organisations found the world over. The Aberdeens, Edinburghs and Glasgows of the United States, the Fraser and Mackenzie rivers of Canada, Dunedin in New Zealand, the Caledonian societies and Burns clubs, and of course the Highland Games that take place all over North America, Australia and New Zealand. For many people of Scottish descent, tracing their ancestral roots is an important way of tracing the richness of their heritage. Stuart Reid outlines some important points for the would-be genealogist.
The best advice I could give to people who are coming to Scotland to do the family tree is to find as much information as possible at home. Now, the best way to do that would be to ask their immediate family, other relatives, perhaps there's a family Bible, anything they can get. The objective would be to find a Scottish link. Now, by that I mean a birth, marriage or death that took place in Scotland. Once you'd ascertained a proper Scottish connection, that's the point to actually go to the record office or use a professional genealogist, and they would then take it back from there. Now, let's say it was an 1865 birth or something like that. There would be a copy of that birth certificate at the record office, which would take you to the next necessary step, for example, the parents' marriage, and so on and so on. It's difficult to say how far you can get back, because every case is completely different. But generally speaking, you're doing pretty well if you get back to the mid-1700s. It is possible to find living relatives in Scotland. A lot would really depend on whether they remained in Scotland and had issue. For example, let's say somebody's grandfather left Scotland. He may have had brothers and sisters who stayed in Scotland. So it is possible to see whether they had children, and so on up to the present day. So the bottom line is yes, we can trace living relatives in Scotland.
Whether you come to trace your roots or just to holiday, for the millions of people of Scottish origin worldwide, returning home to the land of your ancestors is a unique experience. Everywhere you go, and it's so easy to go everywhere, the friendliness of the people awaits you. There are no strangers, only friends you haven't met yet. Secluded villages and stunning surrounds are home to the many traditions and amenities for which Scotland is famous. Among these, it boasts the finest salmon fishing in the world. Where better to play golf than in the land in which it was invented, on the best golf courses in Europe. Whisky distilling is an ancient Scottish art, and people can visit the many distilleries all over the country. And of course, probably the most famous tradition of all, the tartan. Few in Scotland today know more about this age-old Scottish craft than Tony Murray.
The earliest documentary evidence of tartan doesn't appear until the mid-16th century. But there is absolutely no question that tartan is of much greater antiquity. It was not clan tartans as we know them today, but patterns which ranged from the very simple, that of the earliest known specimen of what some people would call tartan, a piece of cloth stuffed in a jar of Roman coins and found in the Falkirk area. It was purely a simple check of two colours, two shades of undyed wool, probably just the product which came to hand, the clippings of some ancient sheep, woven into a pleasant dice of black and white, what today we would call a shepherd's plaid. It was not known as a tartan then. Tartan did not have names. It was not really until much later that tartan acquired names, and especially those of clans. Up until the 18th century, tartan was very much the idea of the local weaver. They ranged from the very simple, muted colours, right through to the beautifully complex designs so typical of that time. These early tartans, of great subtlety of colour, became used mainly in the form of the great plaid, the filamoa. Now, this was a wonderful garment because it was woven so finely by these craftsmen, these local craftsmen, that it was almost waterproof. Following the failure of the Jacobite Rising of 1745, tartan became proscribed for a time. After the repeal of the Prescription Act in 1782, tartan passed from being just the product of the local weaver into an industrial context. With the rise of the industrialization of tartan, an ethic of applying clan names to the various patterns arose, and this reached its height around 1822 when Sir Walter Scott stage managed the great visit of George IV to Edinburgh. And since that time, tartan has become the identifying feature of a clan. The pattern you see before you is that most used by the MacLeans. It is most commonly called MacLean of Duart. It has its origin in the first quarter of the 19th century. Another pattern very common amongst MacLeans is that of the hunting MacLean. This is a simple pattern of green background, black bars and white overlines. From its humble origins on the looms of the local weaver, tartan progressed through industrialization, acquiring as it did the names of clans and families. Today, tartan is a living fabric, but it has progressed even further, for it now represents the names of great states. There are tartans for the various great states in America and in Canada. There is an Australia national tartan. It's an identifying feature of corporations worldwide and continues to develop. Long may it do so.
And when we leave the silence of the countryside, the splendour of Scotland's great cities awaits us, as we find ourselves enwrapped in the still vibrant culture of the Scot.
Edinburgh military tattoo, highlight for thousands every Edinburgh festival, and a showpiece in the calendar of Scottish events. From the wide open spaces of the Esplanade, the pipes and drums of every Scottish regiment wait to carry the sounds of Scotland into the Edinburgh night. One has only to hear it to feel again that surge of pride in a Scottish heritage.